Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here in the Board of Estimates chambers for the August 28th meeting of the city's Board of Finance. The first item on our agenda is a presentation for the board's consideration and approval of the minutes of the prior meeting.
So moved.
I was going to say, does anybody have any concerns or questions? All right, I'll take a motion for approval. So moved. Is there a second? Second. All in favor say aye. Any opposed, nay. Motion carries. Moving on to the second item, presentation for the board's consideration and approval of the security transactions.
Thank you, Controller Henry. So today we have the report that's covering May 15th, 2023 through August 18th, 2023. During that time, we had purchases of $1,060,068,000. And then at the same time period, our redemptions was $895 million. And just for FYI, we did have one security called. It was a long-term piece. If you see at the on page 3, $10 million, 6.15%, and I believe that was a step up. So the rates right now are below the 6, so they have an option of calling that particular security.
Okay, are there any questions about the security transactions?
Yeah, I noticed we're using South Street a lot less than we did in prior years.
Well, we haven't done any repurchase agreements, so that South Street normally services us in our repurchase agreements.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Move approval of the security transactions.
transactions have been moved. Is there a second? Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Now we'll move on to the
Before we go on, I just wanted to mention something about our investments. So Treasury, we're going to be investigating our long-term holdings. Currently, the policy caps it at $100 million. And as you can see, our portfolio has really risen from our average is about, back in 2019, it was like $600 million. Now,
Almost
when we
nine.
closed out in 2023, it's $1.5 billion. And so we've been fluctuating above $1 billion in excess revenue. So basically, we do our investments based on what reserve or what cash is available after we project what our expenditures are going to be for the day. And like I said, the portfolio has increased tremendously, so we're looking to investigate increasing that $100 million higher. We don't know what range it's going to be. We're going to talk to our peers in the area to see if they change theirs in their policy and how far do they go and what their average earning or average portfolio holdings is. So we just want to be in parallel with our peers. And also to make sure that we're getting the maximum amount of earnings on our investments.
When you do that kind of due diligence, do you consider our peer group to be other jurisdictions in Maryland of similar population, or do you look for other cities our size in other states?
We can do both. We can look at our peer group here with the larger counties like Prince George's County, and then we can also look outside of the city as well.
Okay. When do you expect to bring a recommendation to the board?
I guess within a couple of months.
Okay.
When we did a study, we had consultants, I believe, from Richmond study how effective the Board of Finance was. And if you recall, the peer cities that they compared us to were Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, and Buffalo.
Okay.
And it's nice to note
That Detroit is kind of painful.
we were ranked very favorably compared to all of them,
Especially Detroit.
especially Detroit. But Pittsburgh surprised me.
Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Buffalo, and Detroit?
Yep.
Okay.
No, it was all heavy industrial cities, same problems.
Okay.
Okay.
So we take that in the notes.
That's ancient history.
How long ago was that report?
6, 7 years?
Oh, okay.
Or
More? Okay.
maybe more.
Okay.
So maybe before Detroit imploded.
Oh, no, it was while Detroit was imploding.
Oh, okay, okay. Okay. Who did, I'm sorry, who did that report?
We had,
Rockport or Davenport? Davenport.
But Davenport, they did our debt study.
yeah,
That's the debt study and not an investment study. Yeah.
And you have another debt study happening now?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And that is maybe sometime this fall?
Yes.
Okay.
Sometime in October.
Would you try to do would you expect to complete the investment study before or after the debt study?
Probably around the same time frame.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
No.
Okay. Before we start on the interest rate agreement, I'm sorry, I can't say, I keep trying to say exchange, and my eyes just keep jumping ahead to agreement. The city's interest rate exchange agreements, or the swaps, these are just being noted. They don't need to be approved, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Why don't we do them first, and then I have a question after
Okay.
that.
All right, so this is as of January 31st, 2023. Our portfolio balance or the fair market value is $10,189,481. The market value, the last time reported was in April, was $12,271,255. As you can see, the 10-year Treasury increased from 3.44% to 3.97%. And these holdings normally have an invert reaction to the market. So when the Treasury rate goes up, the value of the portfolio decreases.
it's 4.25 today, so the 10-year treasury, so you're going to get another nice reduction.
Yes.
Any other questions on the swaps? I was having a conversation with a colleague a few weeks ago, and I thought I remembered from a previous meeting, you asking if we were decreasing our participation in swaps, and I thought the answer was
Yes.
that we are, on a policy level, trying to get ourselves slowly and reasonably out of having these at all.
That's correct.
Okay.
And that was the answer.
Okay, I thought I remembered that, and when I tried to share that comment, I was asked, are you sure? So I'm confirming.
Yes, I mean, the only one that's kind of, the 2002A bonds, those are ones that's not hedged with an outstanding debt obligation. So we're looking to unwind that swap if we find some savings or additional money within the utility to unwind that swap.
You might want to have a conversation as the Regional Water Task Force moves forward with its work, depending on whether we come up with a structure that is going to involve a change to how we do water financing in the first place. Maybe this could be wrapped into that. So we should talk about that next spring.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Next, we have presentation for the board's consideration and approval, the amended and restated contribution agreement related to the East Baltimore Development Initiative project.
All right. So the board is hereby requested to consider and approve the enclosed amended and restated contribution agreements for the East Baltimore Development Initiative project. In 2007, this board approved authorization of no more than $85 million of taxes and financing bonds for demolition, site preparation, relocation costs within the East Baltimore Development Initiative Development District. The source of the payments of the debt is the Phase 1 and Phase 2 tax increment revenue, the EGRT pilot payment, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and Johns Hopkins Graduate School housing lease payments. The city originally approved the contribution agreement for the 929 North Wolf Street and the DHMD headquarter building in 2013. Under the original agreement, EBDI agreed to make payments of the exempt funds to the city for the debt service on the TIF bonds that was issued to support the Wolf Building and the DHMH headquarters. The 929 North Wolf parcel was ground rent for the 929 Wolf Street LLC, a special purpose entity originally 100% controlled by EBDI to construct and operate the Wolf Building for the graduate school housing for Johns Hopkins University. Moving forward to this time frame, around January 31st, 2022, P3 Foundation purchased 75% of the controlling membership interest of Wolf LLC from EBDI and became the general manager for Wolf LLC. After this purchase, P3 had the authority to direct Wolf LLC to take action under the contribution agreement related to the Wolf Building. As a minority member, EBDI no longer had any power to direct Wolf LLC and will soon transfer 25% interest to P3 Foundation under an agreement agreed by the parties. Given P3's purchase, it is necessary to release EBDI from this obligation related to the Wolf Building and Wolf LLC and to substitute P3 Foundation in its place. The city will be in the same position and will not have its obligation modified and will still receive the exempt funds that it initially agreed to receive underneath the contribution agreement with Wolf LLC. The only change is Wolf LLC is now owned by P3 Foundation instead of EBDI. The structure is not changing for the DHM building. However, the 2013 contribution agreement will be separated into two agreements. It will be amended and restated contribution agreement for the Wolf Building and amended and restated agreement for the DHMH headquarter building, given that P3 is assuming obligations solely related to the Wolf Building and the Wolf LLC. So the organization has asked the city to execute this agreement, or Treasury Manager to execute this agreement. There's really no substantial change in the city position underneath these agreements. So today we do have a representative from EDBI, Ms. Cheryl Washington. We have bond counsel, Alan Kaysen, which is with McGuire Woods, and we have Chris Stinnett from Miles and Stockbridge. So if you have any questions.
Oh, Alan's not here for us. Alan's here for you. He's here for the Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
So he's here representing the city, though. He's the city's bond. He's the city's bond.
Okay. He is here for representing.
Right. He's the
Okay.
city's
all right.
bond counsel.
I've
and
not switched sides.
Yeah, I was confused there for a split second. When
And
you
now
say
it's-
staff and bond counsel, you mean your EBDI staff and our bond counsel?
Correct.
Okay, that was
bond counsel.
the part that threw me.
Okay. Yes. So if there are any questions about this,
Yeah, I have some questions.
Certainly. You have the floor, sir.
Why would we release EBDI from the credit when they're 40 million outstanding to be paid over 40 years? And we don't know what the credit of Wolf is. We don't know who P3 is. I tried to research them on the internet. And theoretically, I suppose the city's not being affected, but we've sold bonds based on this credit. And I'd like to have an understanding of why the city would be willing to do that.
so Alan, do you want me to take?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in on that, and thank you for that question. And let me just step back a little bit from what Janelle mentioned as to why these agreements are in place in the first place. They're unusual. And if we go all the way back to when EBDI was involved in the East Baltimore project, there were two large parcels where the student housing facility is located and also where the DHMH building is now located that were projected to be research facilities and privately owned, so that the anticipation at that time was that those two parcels would generate real property taxes that would ultimately be pledged to the bonds. That projection didn't pan out. There were alternative uses. So you had, the DHMH project, which was financed by Medco, and also the student housing project, which was also financed by Medco. The entity that owned the student housing project was a nonprofit entity, and then obviously DHMH was a state building, and so they did not have to pay real property tax. What the city did to try to protect itself as much as possible at that time was to go back to EBDI, who essentially was the developer. And let's remember, EBDI was created by Baltimore City. It's not sort of a quasi-governmental entity, if you will, but the city went back to EBDI and said, hey, we projected these to be projects that were going to produce tax revenue that would ultimately pay the bonds. They've been developed in a different way, a very good way, but in a different way. What are we going to do about the lost property tax revenues? And to its credit, EBDI went back to both the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and also to the owner of the student housing project, and came up with an agreement from them to pay what we ended up calling a contribution agreement. It was a agreed upon amount in both instances to make up for the loss of traditional property tax revenues. It was a little bit like a pilot agreement, technically not a pilot because they didn't owe taxes in the first place, but they came up with this arrangement, and they made their own contract with these two entities. The Medco deal, which EBDI is not directly involved in, we were able to add a provision in their lease with Medco that provided for the payment of what's called additional rent, which is essentially an amount that could be paid ultimately to protect the bondholders. And then for the 929 project, it was in the form of a ground rent. So that's a little bit of the background. Focusing back on EBDI, they had a primary ownership interest in the 929 Wolf Street student housing project. Medco, almost through a workout, refinanced that last year. And Janelle knows all about this because she kind of made it happen. But last year, the city had difficulty in collecting the payments that were indirectly required under the agreement with EBDI to bring those additional dollars in. With EBDI leaving that transaction, they did approach the city to say, hey, we no longer have a primary ownership interest in the 929 facility. Can we get out? We looked at it in a way, when I first reviewed the documents, Mr. Shelton, and like, why would we do that? Because what benefit of it is to the city? There's already a contractual arrangement that requires Medco at least to make best efforts to collect these dollars and pass them on to the city. When I went back and looked at the agreements, what we saw was that there was no, and as an attorney, you'll understand this, there was no direct privity between the city and the 929 Wolf Street entity to have those payments come to the city. The way the agreements were situated, it was sort of what I would call a best efforts arrangement for EBDI to try to collect those dollars and pass them on to the city. You asked what benefit this is. The one benefit from a legal standpoint is that the way these agreements have been amended and restated, the city is in direct privity with the owner of the 929 project, the 929 Wolf Street entity, and they now have a direct obligation to make these payments, which they really didn't have before. It was sort of an indirect obligation, sort of enforced by EBDI. with EBDI being removed from that student housing project, and I think the thinking is, at least from my point of view, that the city would be better off in direct privity with the owner who had the ability to actually make the payments. The Department of Mental Health and Hygiene arrangement really is essentially remaining unchanged, and that works perfectly. You know, they pay their additional rent, it comes to the city, works perfectly. This one is a little different because of the change of status with EBDI, and I think they're here. They can speak for themselves about what that is, but that was my own review of the documents. Do you have to approve this? No, you don't. I saw it as, one, an accommodation for EBDI. I think of EBDI as a bit of a partner of the city. This is their request. And two, repeating, I do like the idea of being in direct contractual privity with the entity that ultimately owns the property, which is the new entity, with the primary member of which is the P3 Foundation. I am familiar with P3 Foundation. They do transactions sort of all over the country in the public finance space. It's a nonprofit, a federally established nonprofit entity, and they come in and they establish themselves as owners of certain types of projects that have some public benefit, like student housing and other types of transactions. So that's a little long-winded, Mr. Shelton. I apologize for that, but I just wanted to get that in, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that you or any of the board members have.
Well, Mike, thanks very much, and that was very, very helpful. But to me, the issue is a policy issue, among other things, and not only in this case, is we have a contractual relationship with EBDI, and we sold $54 million worth of bonds, and there are still over 40 years, there's $40 million yet to be paid. And we're dealing with EBDI, and they're a nonprofit C3, and they have, the president of Hopkins is on the board. It's a very substantial board. I couldn't find out anything about P3 on the internet. They have their president and their general counsel. But I do think it's a real question when you sell bonds, in effect with what you might perceive to be a guarantor, that you release the guarantor. I'm cutting right through it. Because if we have a direct obligation with EBDI and they have a direct obligation with this Wolf Street, then in effect, I think we've got a line to communicate, although there's not direct privity. Because EBDI is a very substantial nonprofit entity with some very substantial people involved. So I'm trying to wrestle with what seems to me be a very important issue in terms of selling bonds. We, when tried to sell these bonds, and the Casey Foundation apparently bought 20 million, and nobody else would buy the remaining 24 million, and so they took those. And now we're modifying the contractual relationship on which we sold those bonds. And it may be that we can make a good argument. Now, I don't know what the credit of Wolf is. I mean, what is the credit of Wolf Street other than they're an LLC and they get payments for student housing? I do know that EBDI is a very substantial public entity with and it's also a Baltimore entity. So I don't mean to be obstructionist if this is, but I do think it's a troublesome situation.
Okay, those are excellent questions, and if I may address your last point about the credit of the P3 Foundation. I mean, it is a nonprofit. The only thing I can say is that entity is the managing member of the LLC that owns the property now, that actually owns the 929 student housing project. I believe ABDI will not have any ownership interest at some point in the future. So yeah, that's why we thought it was important to have a contractual relationship with them. Let me just, Mr. Shelton, go back to one other point, and it has to do with timing and what the bondholders were promised when the deal was made. And you have to go all the way back to 2008 when the first tranche of bonds was actually issued for the EBDI project. And at that time, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. At that time, there were no projects. These were projects that were anticipated to be built, infrastructure anticipated to be financed with the proceeds of the bonds. And that included these two parcels that we're talking about, which were projected to be, high-tech research, privately owned entities, which would generate significant property tax. And so it was after that, when that did not occur, that the city and EBDI said, hey, we need to, if we can, we need to fill this hole if we can. We thought it was going to be privately owned. It ended up being, nonprofit in one instance, governmental in another. Is there a way to kind of backfill that so that the actual tax revenue projections were equivalent to what they were projected to be? And so that's why these.
It's a nice structure that you put together.
Yeah,
Alan, can I
and-
add something? Remember at the time, they implied heavily that Hopkins was a natural tenant for all of these buildings. And Hopkins shortly thereafter, as I recall, made it perfectly clear that they didn't, that it was probably not in the future that they were going to occupy these buildings, that they had their own program. I remember that very clearly. So I would not overrely on the presence of Hopkins, because they made it perfectly clear that they were not.
My point only was.
I know what your point is, but I'm saying, I don't think the presence of a Hopkins president on the board lends anything to this
Well,
legally.
I'm sorry, did you have?
My comment was just going to be that this transaction has actually strengthened the city's position, one.
Yeah, that's how I.
Two, the purpose of EBDI, they have already now sold their interest, and to be able to release them as a guarantor allows EBDI to further meet their purpose, and that is developing the community, taking on more risk. So the ability to be released from this transaction, I believe, would be beneficial to Baltimore City.
Yeah,
I concur.
I think that it's not at issue whether or not this is a good deal, as much as I think Mr. Shelton is calling attention to the fact that we have an implied responsibility as the people who sold bonds 15 years ago under one plan.
And we're changing the credit.
But here's the thing: we're not just changing the creditor.
No.
We've changed the entire plan. We're no longer paying these off with tax increment.
That's correct.
So we have,
correct.
and EBDI is getting out of the ownership of the project because the project is no longer what EBDI set out to do 15 years ago. I am tempted to opine that this is, not unlike I mentioned several months ago, where the mayor and city council will approve TIFs, and then they go away, and it's left to the Board of Finance to monitor the deal and the project over the course of the decades. And in this case, the project just completely changed. And so I was taking your comments as, what responsibility do we have to the bondholders from what is essentially the original project? What responsibility do we have to them in terms of limiting the changes we make?
I think that's expresses it well.
Yeah.
But I think,
I could answer that.
Well, Alan, if you could hold on for a minute, let Fred speak.
We have, the city has worked to keep the bondholders whole. This would not be the first time, as you well know, that a public issue of a bond has been restructured. It happens all the time. And generally, sometimes the effects are positive and sometimes the effects are very negative on the bondholders. In this case, the city has worked very hard with council and with EBDI to keep the bondholders whole.
I will note in passing that, at the risk of calling down the wrath of Johns Hopkins upon me, that I used to do community development over in Southeast Baltimore, and I worked for a nonprofit entity that rehabbed and rented row houses to resettled refugees as well as others. And it was part of our nonprofit mission to do so. And yet the State Department of Assessments and Taxation rejected our request for tax exemption because, in the words of the state, we were renting market rate housing. And it didn't matter what our nonprofit mission was. And so I have, for the last 15, 20 years, been curious why university housing is not treated similarly, and we could possibly not have to make some of the changes that we've had to make if student housing was also taxed. If it qualified for property taxes, then we would be in a much better position to be paying back the TIF bonds from the actual tax revenue that was originally projected. But be that as it may, since that is not the world we live in, before I turn the floor back over to Alan, I'm not sure who to ask this question of. If this is a finance, maybe it is a city question, in that, were Mr. Shelton's concerns addressed internally in the course of putting this agreement together? Was EBDI treated as a guarantor such that there was any internal conversation over 15 years in, do we still need a guarantor, or has the project, actually I guess technically 2013, so 20 years after this building these buildings were built, are we still concerned? Oh, no, 10 years. 10 years after these buildings were built, are we still in need of a guarantor for this, or have the financials demonstrated that a bondholder would reasonably not be concerned about needing the additional guarantee that having EBDI legally involved would provide?
Yeah, I mean, I could take a shot at that, which is another good question. And again, I go back to 2008 when the bonds were issued, and like all of the city tax increment financing bonds, what the city pledges is real property taxes, the additional real property taxes generated from the properties in the district. And then most of the time, on top of that, there's what's called a special tax. That's a backup tax if there's a shortfall in the assessment value.
Only in
to
this
make
case,
sure.
now that's the primary tax.
Yeah, so, well, so for these two properties, again, there is no real property tax. And the way the special tax works, there, the numbers that are attached to these agreements are sort of designed to replicate their agreement to pay the amount of special tax that would be generated
Except
because
they're
there was.
tax exempt.
That's why you have a
Right.
contribution agreement.
That's right. And so that's why you have these agreements. So
So where's the agreement with Wolf Street?
it's
part of it.
it's here.
So so this just removes, but when did, okay, I guess, because P3 purchased Wolf Street, we never had to have any kind of separate agreement.
No, we didn't have a direct agreement. What
With
we had
P3.
was, we had it was called a contribution agreement between the city and EBDI that essentially required them to make best efforts to collect this money that wasn't being generated by the taxes, which they did. They had they came up with an agreement, but it was not with the city itself. It was an agreement between EBDI and the Wolf Street entity. And so, and it had a scheduled payment. The one legal thing that I like about the way these agreements have evolved is that now the city will have a direct contract with the owner of the property, which we never really had before. As far as going back to the security for the bonds, I would look at this as heavy gravy, right? Because what the bondholders were promised was real property taxes increment. What they got was all of that, although we projected that 2 large properties were going to generate taxes. They didn't because of the way they ended up being developed. And then the city basically tried to go back and fill that hole with these contracts to make a difference there. So as far as how bondholders, I mean, they don't necessarily have a right to these payments. That wasn't what was promised them, but they would very much appreciate the fact that the city and EBDI did make arrangements to make up for the difference in the revenues that were lost the way that the project was developed. And as Mr. Meyer said, development projects change all the time. You don't always get what you expect. Sometimes things don't develop. Sometimes they develop differently. These 2 properties just happened to be developed in a way that they weren't able to be taxed. And this was just an effort to try to fill that hole, and it's just actually worked. If you choose not to approve these, the agreements I think are still in place. It's just a little bit harder for the city to get to the entity directly. It's sort of it's through EBDI, and then EBDI has to try to collect, and if they collect, it comes to the city. This streamlines it, and to me, that's the primary advantage for the city. The good thing about these agreements is this is money coming in, no money's going out, which is
Why was
usually
EBDI separately listed if they were the 100% owner of Wolf Street originally? Why do they need to be taken out? Why wasn't the contribution agreement just with Wolf Street all along?
They were this was a limited liability company, Wolf Street, and they were a member of that. I think Johns Hopkins may have been a member, and then some other entity. I don't know. Chris Sennett is their counsel's on the line. He might know the details. EBDI wasn't the 100% owner of that, if I recall.
Okay.
But they were.
Cheryl seems to be able to share some history.
I was
Okay.
going to clarify, and Chris can certainly confirm, so EBDI was the sole member of 929 Wolf Street LLC.
That's what I thought.
And we transferred 75% of our membership interest to
To
P3
P3,
last year.
And now you're selling the remaining
remaining
25.
25%.
So why was, I guess what now I'm confused about why EBDI was ever separately and specifically mentioned if the contribution agreement is actually with Wolf Street, which you owned 100%.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
then-
I'm not so sure. I mean, the original agreement was between EBDI, Johns Hopkins, because I think they were maybe the ground lessor, and then a third entity called Wolf Street. So I don't know. I mean, maybe Chris Sennett can jump in on that, but
Sure. I think the original agreement is between Chris Sennett here on behalf of EBDI from Miles and Stockbridge. The original agreement was between EBDI, the city, Johns Hopkins, and 929 Wolf Street. And the contribution agreement was originally for both properties, right? So that's why you have, Johns Hopkins involved and the city involved. And this process is just splitting that contribution agreement into separate amended and restated contribution agreements for both buildings. So we have the EBDI, the agreement with EBDI and the city, which is for the DHMH building. Literally nothing is changing there. EBDI is still going to collect the pseudo pilot payments for that building and remit them to the city. This is just the amended and restated contribution agreement for 929. It is just for that building. We're trying to transfer the remaining interests in the Wolf entity to P3 and basically exit the transaction, as that was part of the deal that was struck when Medco refinanced its bonds in 2022. So, I mean, if this isn't approved, we're in a difficult position as EBDI, where we're out, we don't own this Wolf entity anymore. We're not involved in the project anymore, but we're going to have to collect the payments still. I think it'd just be very difficult for EBDI to do that.
So if we
especially as a minor.
do approve this, who is then legally responsible for collecting the payments from 929 and paying them to the city?
Bill, could I make,
Oh,
is the obligation just to collect the payments, or if the payments are insufficient, do they have an obligation to pay the full amount? In other words, is it a recourse obligation, or is it a
No.
payment obligation?
yeah. With regard to EBDI, the only obligation they had was to make best efforts to collect. So it wasn't a
So it's just a collection obligation?
correct.
Now, my understanding, though, was that EBDI has made payments out of their own pocket in times past. Is that incorrect?
Yeah, I cannot speak to that. My understanding is that EBDI, as the owner of Wolf Street, collected the payments from Wolf to the extent they were able. Under this new structure, or this new agreement, I should say, the obligation, as Alan mentioned, is on behalf of Wolf, and Wolf now has this direct obligation to the city to pay these these payments in lieu of taxes, so to speak.
Well, I'm a little bit.
So.
To me, the explanation now is a little different than I got from reading the documents. What you're saying is it's not
Okay.
with EBDI, it's not a recourse obligation. It's just an obligation to collect?
Best effort.
That's what
Best
you're
effort.
saying?
I think that was
Yeah,
made clear.
that's right. Yes, that was and that
Made clear about
Well,
this.
if that's the case, I think that's a good clarification. I think that satisfies my obligation to a large, my concern to a large extent. If it's non-recourse, it's always been just a revenue bond, to collect the revenues and to transmit it. It's a collection,
That's what TIF bonds are all about.
But this is a collection.
Right, but there's no T.
Well, yes, but
There's no TI.
but the TIF disappeared. But
Yeah,
Well,
you're right.
the
Mr.
parties
Sheldon.
there too did their very best to
Right,
keep
if
it.
it's clear, if it's a non-recourse obligation, that satisfies a lot of my concerns.
So if he's satisfied, are we prepared for a motion?
No, I'm sorry, I'm still trying to get clarity on the question of if hypothetically, we have another pandemic, Hopkins has to send students away, and there is no one in the student housing for a year, and no rent is being paid to P3. My question is, since this is no longer a property tax dependent payment, who is responsible for paying the bondholders? Is P3 responsible for making certain that money is paid to the city, whether they're getting rent or not? Who is responsible for paying the bondholders if we move forward with this, who is responsible for paying the bondholders, and what recourse does the city have if they don't pay? Do the bondholders just not get paid? Or
Right,
is the
no.
city in a position where, despite everything that I've heard everyone in the city tell me for 15 years, the city would end up making the bondholder payments for a TIF, which we're not supposed to do?
Right,
Right.
yeah, and I can certainly answer that under the bond documents. The city has no obligation to the bondholders other than to collect the new tax increment and pay debt service with it. So if it's not there, there is no pecuniary obligation of the city to pay debt service. To your question about under these arrangements, who's required to pay, and that would be 929 Wolf Street LLC, which is the owner of the student housing project. And we now would have privity so that if they did not pay, in theory, the city could sue them. They own property, the student housing facility, in theory,
The
could
city
get a
could take the
judgment.
building.
You can, in theory. There's also, failure to pay may be viewed as a trigger under the other documents, which could trigger a tax sale for failure to pay. So that's why I think it's important to have the property owner directly sort of on the hook. But even if they did not pay, that doesn't obligate the city to do anything else. Again, this is a little bit of what I would call belts and suspenders. We do have the tax increment for the entire district that's paying debt service. We have these extra revenue streams, which the city is putting into the pot, if you will. To my knowledge, there have been no issues with the payment of debt service for this project over the years.
Okay. Then I think all questions have been asked and answered. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
All right, we have a motion that is universally made and universally seconded, but for purposes of the minutes, I'll let Mr. Williams have made the motion, and Mr. Meyer second. And all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. Motion carries. We are done with our business unless anyone has anything additional for the good of the order. Seeing none, the next meeting will be on September 25th, 2023, here in the Board of Estimates chambers at 3 p.m. And we are adjourned. Thank you very much.